For 25 years, I lived inside a truth that felt carved into my bones. I believed I was adopted. I believed I should be grateful. I believed my life in that cramped house on the edge of Cleveland, Ohio, was the only life I deserved. Diane and Mark Sloan told me that story so many times that it settled into my skin like a stain. They repeated it every time I asked why nothing in the house belonged to me. Why didn't I have photos on the wall like their children? Why does my birthday pass every year without a cake? They always said it was because I was lucky to have a home at all, and that I should respect the family who rescued me. But the truth is, they never treated me like part of the family. They treated me like the house had been sold with a built-in maid. I woke long before anyone else, usually around 5 in the morning, because Diane wanted breakfast ready before she even stepped out of her bedroom. I washed dishes, mopped the kitchen floor, scrubbed bathroom tiles, and wiped down every surface until my hands were raw. If my brother Ryan spilled cereal or juice, it was my fault for not keeping an eye on him. If my sister Chloe didn't like her meal, Diane would shove the plate toward me and say, "Eat it, Maid. We don't waste food on you." The word Maid stuck to me like a label I couldn't peel off, used by the people who swore they had taken me in out of compassion. They called me the family Maid even in front of guests. Diane always laughed afterward, as if the humiliation was a joke I was expected to enjoy. Mark only used the word when he was angry, which was often. Whenever bills were late, or his job wasn't going well, he needed someone to blame. And I was the easiest target, a convenient punching bag for his stress and frustration. By the time I reached 25, I had learned to make myself small. I moved quietly, spoke softly, and apologized even when I didn't know what I was apologizing for. I convinced myself my life was normal because believing anything else would have forced me to face a darker truth. Nobody wants to believe they are unloved on purpose. So I carried that belief like a shield, even though it hurt more than it helped. The only person who ever softened that pain was my grandfather, Harold Sloan. He wasn't really my grandfather, though I didn't know that at the time. He lived in Boston in an old brick house with heavy curtains, wooden floors, and the faint scent of old books. When I was young, he would slide me a piece of chocolate when Diane wasn't looking. He would pat the chair beside him and let me sit quietly while he read the newspaper. Those moments were the closest thing to peace I knew. So when he passed away, I went to the funeral even though Diane didn't want me there. She said funerals were family matters, and I didn't qualify. But Harold had been the only gentle person in my life, and I refused to stay behind. Diane didn't argue much, probably because she didn't want to start a scene in front of her relatives. The funeral was held in a stone church in Boston, filled with cold air and the smell of lilies. The stained glass cast colors on the floor, but none of it felt warm. People whispered in the pews, dressed in black, their voices echoing against the walls. Diane cried loudly, too loudly. The kind of crying meant to draw attention instead of release grief. Chloe hovered beside her, perfect as always, adjusting her dress every few minutes. Ryan leaned against the wall, focused on his phone as if losing a family member was just another inconvenience in his day. I stood at the back, alone as always, hands clasped, head lowered. I felt more like a stranger than family. Nobody greeted me. Nobody asked why I looked tired. Nobody saw me. That was when I noticed him. A man stood near the entrance, tall and sharply dressed in a suit that looked expensive without being flashy. His beard was neatly trimmed, his posture straight, and his eyes kept scanning the room with a focus that didn't match the somber atmosphere. He didn't look like a mourner. He looked like someone searching for something or someone. When his gaze landed on me, something shifted in his expression.
Surprise.
Recognition. A flicker of something he immediately tried to hide. He walked toward me slowly, as if afraid he might be mistaken. When he reached me, he leaned in, speaking in a low, controlled voice. "You were kidnapped," he whispered. "Your real parents never abandoned you." The air left my lungs. My knees weakened. My heart hammered so hard I wondered if he could hear it. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the cruel twist, waiting for anything that would make sense of the words he had just said. But he didn't back down. He took out his phone and played a grainy old news clip. A desperate man stood at a podium, tear-stained and shaking, begging the country for help in finding his missing daughter. A woman beside him looked hollow, exhausted, shattered. Under the video flashed a headline about a missing child of one of America's wealthiest families. And below that headline, a number that made my throat close. $300 million reward. My hands trembled as I held the phone. The church suddenly felt too small, too bright, too loud. My ears rang. My vision blurred. "My name is Ethan Brooks," the man said. "I used to work for them. I never forgot your face." I should have walked away. I should have told him he had mistaken me for someone else. Instead, I whispered, barely audible, "I want to meet them." He nodded once, as if he had been waiting years for me to say those words. Ethan stepped aside, lifted his phone, and made a single call. Within minutes, everything I thought I knew about my life began to fall apart. At first, I didn't understand what I was hearing. The faint wail in the distance sounded like nothing more than traffic echoing off Boston's narrow streets. I kept my head down, my hands tight around the small program from my grandfather's service. Then the sound grew sharper, louder, and closer. It wasn't one siren. There were many. Dozens. The kind that makes the air itself throb. People in the church turned their heads. Whispers rustled through the pews like a sudden wind. Diane's loud, theatrical crying stopped so abruptly it was almost comical. She lifted her head, mascara streaked down her cheeks, and looked around with wide, suspicious eyes. Mark's face drained of color, and for the first time in my life, I saw real fear on him. Fear that didn't involve being late on bills or losing a job. This fear was deeper, older, and bone-level. Then the church doors flew open. Uniforms poured in. First city police officers, then state vehicles screeching to a halt outside, lights bouncing through the stained glass windows. And then men in military gear entered in tight formation, their boots echoing against the stone floor. The entire room erupted into confusion. People stood from their seats, some praying, some panicking, some clutching their coats like shields. I stayed frozen near the back wall, my body stiff, my breath thin. Ethan walked toward me, cutting through the chaos with calm, steady steps. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't unsettled. He looked like a man who knew exactly what was coming. "They're coming," he said quietly. The words felt unreal, too cinematic to belong in my life. For 25 years, nothing extraordinary had ever happened to me. I was the girl who scrubbed floors and stayed silent. I was the maid, the helper, the invisible one. And now, someone was coming for me? It made no sense. Then I saw him. A man shoved his way through the crowd with wild urgency. People stepped aside instinctively, sensing something enormous in his presence. His suit was expensive but disheveled, as if he'd dressed in a rush. His tie hung crooked, his hair was gray at the temples, and his face was etched with a desperation I had never seen on another human being. His voice cracked through the church like thunder. "Where is my daughter?" Everything in the room stopped. Even the priest stood motionless, eyes wide, hands frozen mid-blessing. The air held still, like the world itself was holding its breath. A woman followed behind the man, trembling so hard she could barely stand. Her hands clutched a small handbag to her chest, and tears streamed down her face without pause. She looked like she had survived decades of heartbreak without a day of rest. Security crowded behind them, officers with radios, agents in dark suits, men scanning every face. It didn't feel like a funeral anymore. It felt like a rescue mission. My heart slammed against my ribs. My hands went cold. My feet refused to move. Something deep inside me, a small, frightened child I thought I had buried long ago, rose to the surface. The man's eyes swept the room, quick and sharp. Searching, hoping, breaking. Then his gaze found me. He froze. In that instant, every emotion a human being could possess flickered across his face. Fear, disbelief, heartbreak, fury, overwhelming love, and something I didn't recognize until later. Recognition. I felt my breath leave my body. My knees nearly buckled. He took a step toward me, slow at first, like he was afraid I would vanish. Then another step. Then another, each one heavier than the last. His voice came out as a broken whisper. Maya? My name. The name I had never even known was mine. I hadn't told Ethan my name that day in the hallway. I hadn't told anyone anything. Yet this man spoke it with the weight of someone who had carried it for years, afraid the sound of it might destroy him. The room dimmed around me. My vision blurred at the edges. My chest tightened, and I felt something hot sting my eyes. I took one small step forward. And he ran. He closed the distance and pulled me into a crushing embrace that felt like a lifetime of longing poured into a single moment. His arms wrapped around me with a desperate strength that made every lie I had been told crumble inside me. I heard him sob into my hair, his entire body shaking against mine. I didn't know him. Not really. But the way he held me told me he had known me every day of his life. Somebody had been waiting for me. He pulled back just enough to cup my face in his hands. His thumbs trembled as they brushed my cheeks. His eyes, blue, filled with tears, searched mine like he was making sure I was real. I'm Richard Callahan, he said, voice raw. I'm your father. I've been looking for you for 25 years. My father. The woman behind him stepped closer and gently took my hand, her touch soft and shaking. I'm Evelyn, she whispered. Your mother. Her fingers intertwined with mine like she was afraid I would slip away again. The grief in her eyes was overwhelming. Her shoulders sagged with years of suffering. Yet she looked at me with a tenderness I had never seen in Diane's face. I stared at them both, trying to reconcile the features I saw in the mirror with the one standing before me. Their eyes, their jaws, their expressions. I saw myself in both of them, and something inside me snapped. A dam I didn't know I had shoved open, and a sound escaped me, raw, broken, aching. I cried. Not a polite tear. Not a quiet sob. A lifetime of grief poured out of me in one violent, overwhelming wave. Behind me, Diane screamed. It wasn't a shock. It wasn't confusion. It was fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. Mark tried to slip away through the side aisle, but 2 officers caught him by the arm. Another officer blocked Diane's path as she clawed at her coat. Chloe stood frozen, her perfect world collapsing. Ryan looked around in confusion, trying to understand a situation far bigger than he had ever imagined. Ethan leaned beside me and whispered, "They have enough to open a case right now." I looked at the people who had raised me, not as a daughter, but as labor. People who had beaten me down, starved me, belittled me, and convinced me I was worthless. And for the first time in my life, looking at them didn't hurt. It felt like a release. It felt like freedom. It felt like the beginning of the truth. After the funeral, the officers didn't give me a chance to return to Cleveland, and honestly, I didn't ask for one. They escorted me out of the church with Richard and Evelyn close behind, keeping their hands near me like they were afraid I might slip through their fingers again. A security team guided us into a black SUV, and within minutes we were being driven through Boston's narrow streets, sirens clearing the path ahead. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't ask. My mind was spinning too fast to form questions. My heart still felt bruised from the moment Richard called me his daughter. I kept hearing his voice in my head, trembling with years of pain. That word, daughter, echoed inside me with a weight I had never felt before. We flew to Atlanta later that night because the investigative team there had the resources needed to handle a case of this size. They placed me in a secured apartment with officers stationed outside the door and cameras covering every hallway. Inside, a doctor checked me for injuries while a gentle-voiced nurse asked if I needed anything to help me sleep. I didn't. Sleep felt impossible. My thoughts were too loud, too chaotic, too full of memories I never understood until now. Richard and Evelyn stayed with me, though they gave me space when I needed it. They sat on the sofa, holding hands like they were afraid to lose each other again. Now and then, Evelyn would walk over and brush a strand of hair from my face, her fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't just affection. It was grief. She was touching a daughter she hadn't held in 25 years. Richard was quieter. He watched me the way a person watches a priceless artifact, afraid of blinking, afraid of waking up from a dream. Sometimes he opened his mouth like he wanted to speak, but no words came out. He simply looked at me with a mixture of love and heartbreak, as if he was trying to memorize every detail so he could never lose me again. The next days moved in a blur, fast and heavy like the ground was shifting under my feet. There were DNA tests, taken carefully, respectfully, without the coldness I expected from medical procedures. I watched the swabs go into sealed envelopes, each marked with chain of custody signatures. The officers treated my samples like they were precious evidence, because they were. They were proof of a crime that had stolen an entire childhood. There were interviews with investigators who asked about my life with Diane and Mark. They didn't pressure me. They paused often. They offered water, breaks, and tissues. But the questions still carved through old wounds I had never spoken aloud. They asked about punishments, about chores, about why they called me the maid. They asked if I had ever seen medical records, paperwork, or anything that could show how I ended up with the Sloanes. I told them what I could, though some memories came in pieces, sharp and jagged like broken glass. Then came the evidence. Official documents. Fake birth records. A cashier's check written decades ago. A thin trail of money that started in Boston and mysteriously stopped in Cleveland around the time I appeared in the Sloane household. Detectives uncovered witnesses, neighbors, old acquaintances, even a bartender, people who remembered Diane bragging about taking in a kid with a payout attached. Every piece of evidence built a truth I had never dared imagine. I hadn't been abandoned. I hadn't been unwanted. I hadn't been taken in out of kindness. I had been stolen. The proof came together faster than anyone expected. The district attorney took the case immediately. A court date was set with an urgency that made my head spin. Apparently, when a billionaire family has been searching for their missing daughter for a quarter of a century, the justice system stops dragging its feet. The courtroom felt colder than the church. The lighting was harsh, the walls stark, the atmosphere tense. Richard and Evelyn sat with me, their hands in mine. Their presence grounded me, reminding me I wasn't alone anymore. Diane was the first to take the stand. She wore a stiff blazer, her hair pulled back tightly, her face painted with exaggerated grief. She cried loudly, again, too loudly, claiming she had done her best, that she had raised me with love, that she sacrificed her life for a child who didn't belong to her. She spoke like she was the victim, like she deserved sympathy. I felt nothing for her. No anger, no sadness. Just emptiness. But the prosecutor was ready. He played recordings taken from interviews with Diane's friends. Women who laughed about her calling me the family maid. People who remembered her ordering me to clean floors at midnight or sleep on the couch when guests visited. They revealed how she joked about me never leaving because I had nowhere else to go. Then came Mark's evidence. Old texts pulled from his recovered phone data. Messages where he mocked me, called me worthless, and said if I ever ran away, nobody would look for her anyway. Those words hit the room like a physical blow. I sat very still, my hands clenched until my nails dug deep into my palms. I could feel Richard tense beside me, his jaw tightening with rage. Evelyn whispered something under her breath, something soft and aching. Diane's acting crumbled fast. Her tears ran dry. Her expressions faltered. Everything she said began contradicting itself. The judge watched her with a cold, steady gaze that gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. When the verdict was read, the courtroom went silent.
Guilty.
Guilty on all charges. Kidnapping, fraud, child abuse, falsifying documents, financial crimes, count after count. The sentences were long. Decades. No early release. No special treatment. No excuses. As the officers moved to take them into custody, Diane turned her head toward me. Her eyes were wide, furious, filled with a hatred I didn't recognize but didn't fear. For a brief moment, I thought she might scream one last insult, that she might call me maid, servant, ungrateful. But she didn't. She opened her mouth and no sound came out. She had nothing left. And I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even nod. I simply exhaled, feeling the weight of 25 years lift off my chest. For the first time in my life, the truth wasn't something used against me. It had teeth now. And it had finally bitten back. A month after the trial, I found myself standing in front of a house that felt too beautiful for someone like me. It was in Boston, not far from the quiet brick street where my grandfather Harold had lived. The house had wide windows that caught the morning sun, soft light spilling across polished hardwood floors inside. The porch didn't sag. The railings weren't peeling. The garden looked like it had been brushed with velvet and watered with care, not like the patchy yard I grew up raking in Cleveland just to stop Mark from yelling. For a moment, I stood frozen on the sidewalk, unable to breathe. This house wasn't just a building. It was a life I had never been allowed to imagine. A life built with care, not cruelty. A life prepared by people who had never stopped hoping I would come home. Richard stood beside me, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. His expression was gentle, almost cautious. "It isn't a palace," he said softly. "Not compared to the others. But it's yours. Only if you want it." I nodded, but my stomach felt twisted. Money didn't disgust me. It didn't tempt me. It scared me. Not because I didn't want it, but because it made the truth sharper. This house represented everything I'd been denied. Every birthday that passed without a gift. Every night, I slept on the couch because Diane wanted visitors to have the normal beds. Every chance at education, travel, childhood, love, safety, all of it taken. Not lost. Stolen. Money made that loss visible. But it also made something else visible. I had a place now. A real place. Inside, Evelyn waited for me, walking slowly from room to room with her fingers brushing across surfaces like she was blessing the house to welcome me. When she saw me step through the doorway, she hugged me so tightly her breath shuddered against my shoulder. "We've missed so much," she whispered. "But we're here. For all the days ahead." Richard didn't flood me with apologies or promises. They didn't try to erase the past by giving me gifts. They didn't parade me in front of cameras or turn me into a headline. They gave interviews only when the investigation required it, and even then, they protected my name fiercely, as if it were sacred. They didn't want revenge. They wanted me. That truth alone broke me in the most unexpected, gentle way. One evening, not long after I moved in, Richard sat with me at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft tick of the antique clock on the wall. He slid a thick folder toward me. Inside were papers I didn't understand at first: trusts, accounts, property, investments. More zeros than I'd ever seen in my life. Pages full of numbers representing a life I could have had, a life Harold had prepared for me long before he knew he wouldn't live to see me return. "Your grandfather set this up," Richard said, voice steady but warm. "He never stopped believing we'd find you. Everything here is yours. No conditions. No strings. Just what was always meant for you." My breath trembled in my chest. It wasn't greed that overwhelmed me. It was the realization that someone somewhere had been building a future for me while I was scrubbing floors and being called a maid. I pressed my hands against the table to steady myself. I didn't become a new person overnight. Healing didn't arrive like a surprise gift with a neat ribbon. It came slowly, like sunrise spreading light inch by inch after a long storm. Some mornings, I still woke at 5, my body expecting chores. Sometimes when someone raised their voice, even accidentally, my shoulders tensed and my heart raced. I still apologized too quickly, too often, as if fear had become a language I'd spent years learning. But now I had space to unlearn it. I started therapy. Real therapy, with someone trained to help people rebuild themselves. I learned how to breathe through panic without hiding it. I learned how to say no without the fear of punishment. I learned how to sit in a quiet room without inventing work to prove I deserved to exist. Most importantly, I learned how to look in a mirror and see a woman instead of a worker. Evelyn kept helping me in ways that made my heart ache. She taught me family recipes, Chicken stew, lemon shortbread, the roast Harold used to love so much. Simple things Diane had never allowed me to try cooking, always insisting the kitchen belonged only to her. We spent slow afternoons in the garden, planting flowers and herbs, laughing when the soil stained my jeans. Richard took me to charity events and introduced me simply, proudly, as his daughter. No dramatics. No pity. No mention of the past unless I brought it up. He never introduced me as a tragedy. Only as family. Months later, when I finally felt steady enough to make decisions about the trust, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with a portion of it. I created a shelter program for young women in America who aged out of foster care or survived neglect, girls who felt invisible, unwanted, or treated like burdens. I named it Harold House. The day the sign went up on the front lawn of our first building, I stood in the wind and felt tears roll down my cheeks. I thought of the little girl in the old news clip, missing and afraid. I thought of the young woman in Cleveland scrubbing floors, being called the Maid, believing she was nobody. And then I realized something that struck me so deeply, it nearly buckled my knees. I wasn't abandoned. I was taken. And now I had been returned, not to the life I lost, but to the life I deserved to build. A life where I could choose who I wanted to be. A life where healing didn't have to be hurried. A life where love, for the first time, was real and freely given. A life where I was finally home.